What would you do if your neighbor's son got involved in a secret relationship with your husband? Would you confront him? Expose them? Or would you keep the secret to protect your family? Pastor Elias thought he could live the perfect life. A devoted preacher, a loving husband, and a trusted figure in his community. But when forbidden desires led him into a hidden affair with Aiden, the neighbor's 20-year-old son, everything spiraled out of control. Lies, betrayal, and a shocking death would tear apart their world, leaving no one untouched. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking twists in this story of love, deceit, and ultimate justice. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. This is a story you'll want to hear to the very end. In the small, close-knit town of Spring Haven, Pastor Elias and his wife Naomi were the golden couple. Newly married, they seemed to embody everything the community admired: faith, love, and commitment. Elias, at 34, was the town's youngest preacher, with a natural charisma that drew people into his sermons. Naomi, at 30, complemented him perfectly with her grace and warmth, leading church events and supporting her husband with unwavering devotion. Together, they were seen as the epitome of righteousness, the kind of couple parents pointed to as role models for their children. But the reality behind closed doors was far more complex. Elias had always known he was different. Long before he met Naomi or became a preacher, he struggled with feelings he couldn't reconcile with his faith. For years, he convinced himself that marrying Naomi and dedicating his life to God would make those feelings disappear. And for a time it seemed to work. He loved Naomi in his own way, and the admiration of his congregation filled him with purpose. But something inside him remained unsettled, a shadow he couldn't quite escape. The first crack in their perfect life appeared when their neighbors, the Harris family, moved back to Spring Haven after several years away. Naomi quickly befriended Olivia Harris, the warm but outspoken matriarch, and began inviting her family over for dinners and community events. Among the Harris family was Aiden, their 20-year-old son, who had grown into a confident and charming young man. Elias couldn't ignore Aiden's presence. The way he carried himself with ease, the quick wit he displayed in conversations, it was magnetic. And while Elias tried to dismiss his growing interest, the more time they spent together at church gatherings and casual neighborly visits, the more difficult it became to maintain his composure. For Aiden, life in Spring Haven was stifling. Having returned from college to help his family during a rough patch, he found the town's conservative values and small-minded gossip exhausting. But Elias intrigued him. The preacher's measured words, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was clear Elias was hiding something. Their first private conversation happened after a church fundraiser. Aiden lingered behind as the other guests left, offering to help Elias pack up. They talked about mundane things at first: sports, college, small-town life. But something unspoken hung in the air, a tension neither of them addressed. As weeks turned into months, their interactions grew more frequent. Late-night text exchanges about faith and doubt became the norm. Elias justified it as mentorship, guiding a young man struggling with his place in the world. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. Naomi began to notice the change in Elias. He seemed distracted, distant, and less engaged at home. When she asked if something was wrong, he brushed it off, saying he was simply busy with church responsibilities. Naomi wanted to believe him. After all, he was her husband, and they were building their life together. But her instincts told her something wasn't right, and she was about to discover just how right she was. It happened late one evening after choir practice, when the church was nearly empty, the only sounds coming from the faint echo of footsteps and the occasional creak of the old wooden pews. Aiden lingered behind, as he often did these days, waiting for Elias to finish tidying up the sanctuary. "Long day?" Aiden asked, leaning against the doorway, his voice casual but edged with curiosity. Elias smiled faintly, wiping dust from the altar. "Long week," he admitted. "You take on too much," Aiden said, stepping closer. "You're always trying to fix everything for everyone. But who takes care of you?" The question caught Elias off guard. It was simple but disarming, the kind of thing no one had ever asked him before. For a moment he faltered, searching for a reply. "I have Naomi," he said, almost as though convincing himself. Aiden's gaze lingered on him, quiet but piercing. "Do you?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Elias wanted to dismiss them, to laugh it off or change the subject. But he didn't. Instead, he found himself looking at Aiden in a way he hadn't allowed himself to before, fully acknowledging the connection he had been suppressing for months. It was that moment that shifted everything. Their affair began slowly, cautiously, as if both were afraid of crossing a line they couldn't return from. It started with long conversations in the church office after everyone had gone home, talks that ventured beyond scripture and into the depths of their fears and desires. Aiden opened up about the struggles of being openly gay in a conservative town, how he had been judged and rejected for simply being himself. Elias, in turn, shared pieces of his own internal battle, the years of guilt, repression, and the growing feeling that he was living a lie. Those late-night conversations became the foundation for something deeper. Aiden was bold, confident in ways Elias admired, but couldn't emulate. And Aiden saw in Elias a vulnerability that made him human, not just the untouchable figure at the pulpit. One night, as they sat together in the quiet solitude of the church, Aiden reached out and took Elias's hand. The simple gesture sent a jolt through Elias, who pulled away instinctively, glancing toward the door as if someone might see. "No one's here," Aiden said softly, his voice steady. "It's just us." Elias hesitated, torn between his duty and his desires, but something inside him gave way. Slowly, he allowed himself to lean in, closing the gap between them. It wasn't planned or calculated. It was raw and overwhelming, years of repression crashing down in a single moment. But as their connection deepened, so did the risks. Elias began fabricating excuses to spend more time at the church, claiming late-night prayer sessions and extra counseling hours. Naomi, meanwhile, grew increasingly concerned. She noticed the way Elias would avoid eye contact when she asked where he had been, or how he always seemed to be checking his phone, smiling faintly at messages he wouldn't let her see. For the first time in their marriage, Naomi felt truly alone. And her suspicions were about to drive her to a dangerous discovery. Naomi prided herself on being an attentive wife. She had always been good at noticing the small details others overlooked. The way Elias's sermons had grown less passionate. The quiet sighs he let out when he thought she wasn't listening. And most of all, the distance that seemed to grow between them with every passing day. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Marriage was an adjustment, after all, and being a preacher's wife came with its own unique challenges. But the signs were becoming harder to ignore. Elias had started coming home later than usual, often blaming his absences on church work. He would slip out early in the mornings, mumbling something about needing quiet time for prayer. One evening, Naomi noticed Elias's phone lighting up on the kitchen counter. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Aiden. "Same time tonight?" A pang of unease shot through her. Naomi had always liked Aiden. He was friendly, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in helping out at the church. But lately she couldn't help but notice how often Elias mentioned him in passing, or how Aiden seemed to linger around Elias during church events. Naomi didn't confront Elias right away. She wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, even as her instincts screamed otherwise. Instead, she began watching more closely, piecing together small clues. She noticed how Elias seemed to brighten whenever Aiden was around, the way his posture would relax or his tone would soften. She caught glimpses of text messages, short, seemingly harmless exchanges, but the frequency of them was enough to raise alarms. Naomi also started hearing whispers around town. Spring Haven was a small place, and people talked. A few church members had commented on how often Elias and Aiden were seen together, working late nights at the church or having private conversations in quiet corners. The breaking point came one Sunday after service. Naomi overheard Aiden speaking with another young man from the congregation. "Elias has a lot on his plate," Aiden said casually, "but I think I'm helping him manage it." The comment was vague, but it sent Naomi's mind into overdrive. That evening, Naomi sat alone in their bedroom, staring at the wedding photo on her nightstand. In the picture, Elias looked at her with such warmth and devotion, but now that look felt like a distant memory. She resolved to find out the truth. Naomi wasn't the type to act impulsively. She knew that if her suspicions were correct, confronting Elias too soon could lead to more lies. Instead, she decided to bide her time, observe, and gather evidence. Her plan began the next day. She encouraged Elias to invite Aiden over for dinner, masking her intentions with a smile. "You've been working so hard," she said sweetly. "It'll be nice to relax with friends." Elias hesitated, but agreed, unaware that Naomi's kind gesture was the first step in her plan to uncover his secrets. As they sat around the dinner table that night, Naomi watched the two of them closely. Every glance, every word exchanged between them, fed her growing certainty that something was happening behind her back, and she knew she wouldn't rest until she found out exactly what it was. For Aiden, the excitement of the affair was starting to wear thin. At first, he had enjoyed the thrill of being with someone like Elias, a man who carried himself with quiet authority and moral conviction. There was something intoxicating about knowing he could break through the preacher's polished exterior. But as the weeks turned into months, Aiden began to feel like a secret Elias was ashamed of, rather than someone he truly cared about. The turning point came one evening when they met at the church after hours, as they often did. Aiden had spent the day trying to reach Elias, only to be met with vague replies and promises to talk later. When Elias finally arrived, he seemed distracted, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. "We need to be careful," Elias said, his voice low as he closed the church doors behind him. Aiden crossed his arms, leaning against a pew. "Careful? That's all you ever say. I'm starting to think this is all I am to you, a dirty little secret." Elias looked at him sharply. "It's not like that. You know how complicated this is for me." "Do I?" Aiden shot back. "Because all I see is someone who's too afraid to be honest about what he wants. You talk about faith and integrity, but you're living a lie, Elias. How long do you think you can keep this up?" Elias's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't respond. "This isn't just about me," he said finally. "It's about Naomi, the church, everything I've worked for. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." Aiden's frustration boiled over. "You think I don't understand pressure? I've lived my whole life being judged for who I am. At least I've had the guts to be honest about it." The words hit Elias like a punch to the gut. He turned away, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the right response. "I care about you," he said softly, "but it's not simple. You have to give me time." Aiden shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Time? You're not looking for time, Elias. You're looking for a way to keep everything exactly how it is." "Well, guess what? I'm not going to wait around forever." With that, Aiden walked out of the church, leaving Elias standing alone in the dimly lit sanctuary. Unbeknownst to both of them, Naomi had started piecing together more of the puzzle. She noticed how tense Elias seemed whenever Aiden's name came up, how he would avoid answering direct questions about their interactions. Her suspicions deepened when she found a receipt for 2 coffee orders from a shop near the church, on a day Elias had told her he was meeting with a church elder. Naomi decided to escalate her investigation. She began keeping closer track of Elias's schedule, jotting down the times he claimed to be working late. She even went so far as to check the GPS history on his phone, confirming trips to places that didn't align with his alibis. But it wasn't just Naomi who was becoming restless. Aiden, tired of being hidden and feeling increasingly resentful, began considering drastic measures. If he's not going to tell her, Aiden thought bitterly, maybe I should. That night, Aiden sent Elias a message. We need to talk. No more hiding. Elias read the text with a sinking feeling. He knew the walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before the life he had worked so hard to build came crashing down. Naomi was no longer looking for signs. She already knew. The distance between her and Elias, the late-night disappearances, and the undeniable connection she saw between her husband and Aiden had painted a clear enough picture. But she wanted proof, something undeniable that Elias couldn't talk his way out of. She didn't confront him outright. Naomi was calculated, masking her growing anger with gentle smiles and supportive words. To Elias, she seemed like the same devoted wife she had always been. He had no idea that she was carefully setting the stage for his downfall. Her plan began with a suggestion. Why don't we host a small dinner here this weekend? She asked Elias one evening, keeping her tone light. You've been so busy lately. It'll be nice to have some friends over. Elias hesitated, sensing her sudden interest in social gatherings wasn't entirely genuine, but Naomi didn't give him a chance to argue. We'll invite Olivia and her family, she continued, and of course Aiden. You two seem to get along so well. It'll be nice for him to feel included. Elias's stomach tightened, but he nodded. Sure, he said, forcing a smile. The night of the dinner, Naomi was the perfect hostess. She prepared an elaborate meal, filling their modest home with the comforting smells of roasted chicken and warm bread. She chatted warmly with Olivia and her husband, laughing at their jokes and sharing stories about life in Spring Haven. But her real focus was on Elias and Aiden. She watched their every move, noting how Elias's gaze lingered on Aiden for a fraction too long, or how Aiden seemed to light up whenever Elias spoke. When dinner ended and the guests began drifting toward the living room, Naomi made her move. Aiden, could you help Elias with the dishes? She asked sweetly. I'll finish up in here. Elias glanced at her, his face unreadable, but he didn't protest. Aiden followed him into the kitchen, the two of them quickly falling into a hushed conversation as they loaded plates into the sink. Naomi waited until they were alone, her heart pounding as she crept toward the kitchen door. She paused just out of sight, straining to hear their words. You need to stop texting me so much, Elias said, his voice low but firm. Naomi's starting to notice. Aiden scoffed. Maybe she wouldn't have to notice if you weren't so afraid of being honest. How much longer do you think you can keep this up? I'm trying, Elias replied, his tone desperate. But you don't understand. This isn't just about us. My entire life is on the line. And what about my life? Aiden shot back. I'm tired of being your secret. Either you tell her the truth or I will. Naomi froze, her breath catching in her throat. The confirmation hit her like a blow, but instead of confronting them, she retreated, her mind racing. That night, as Elias lay asleep beside her, Naomi sat awake in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. She wasn't just angry. She was humiliated, betrayed, and determined to make Elias pay for what he had done. Her mind settled on a plan. If Elias thought he could keep his secret forever, he was sorely mistaken. Naomi would force him to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Naomi's plan came to fruition on a stormy evening, when the wind howled through Spring Haven, and rain lashed against the windows. She had invited Aiden over under the guise of needing help with a church charity event. Elias, unprepared for the meeting, was visibly uneasy when Aiden arrived. Naomi's cheerful demeanor only heightened the tension in the room. Once Aiden was inside, Naomi wasted no time. She set the stage carefully, asking Aiden and Elias to sit together in the living room while she prepared tea in the kitchen, But instead of preparing drinks, she stood silently at the edge of the doorway, listening to their conversation. Aiden spoke first, his voice edged with frustration. "You can't keep avoiding this, Elias. We need to talk about us. About her." Elias glanced nervously toward the kitchen, lowering his voice. "I told you, Aiden, I need time. Naomi doesn't deserve to be hurt like this. I'm trying to figure out the right way to handle it." "Handle it?" Aiden snapped. "You're not handling anything. You're just dragging this out because you're afraid. But I won't let you keep using me, Elias. Either you tell her, or I will." Naomi stepped into the room, her presence sharp and commanding. "You don't need to tell me anything," she said coolly. "I've already figured it out." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Aiden froze, his face pale as he realized Naomi had been listening. Elias, on the other hand, looked utterly defeated. "Naomi," Elias began, his voice trembling, "I can explain." "Explain what?" she interrupted, her tone icy. "That you've been lying to me? That you've been sneaking around with him while I've been at home trusting you? What part of this do you think you can justify?" Aiden stood, his frustration boiling over. "Maybe if you weren't so perfect all the time, Elias wouldn't have to lie." Naomi's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare blame this on me." The argument escalated quickly, with all three of them shouting over each other. Years of resentment, betrayal, and guilt erupted in the span of minutes. Naomi accused Elias of ruining their marriage, while Aiden demanded he take responsibility for his actions. Elias, caught between the two of them, finally broke down. "I'm sorry," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt anyone." But his apology did little to calm the storm. In the chaos, Aiden stepped forward, his anger directed at Elias. "You've been hiding behind your faith, your wife, your pulpit, but you're nothing but a coward." Elias grabbed Aiden's arm, his desperation turning into panic. "You don't understand what I've been through." Naomi, furious and feeling cornered, tried to pull Aiden away, yelling for both men to stop. In the scuffle, Aiden stumbled, his foot catching on the edge of the coffee table. He fell backward, his head striking the corner of the fireplace with a sickening thud. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the sound of rain pounding against the windows. Naomi and Elias stared at Aiden's motionless body, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Elias dropped to his knees beside Aiden, shaking him desperately. "Aiden? Aiden, wake up." But it was too late. Aiden was gone. Naomi pressed her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "What have we done?" she whispered. Elias looked up at her, his face pale and streaked with tears. "We need to call someone," he said, his voice trembling. But Naomi shook her head. "No one can know about this. Do you understand me? No one." Elias stared at her in disbelief, but deep down, he knew she was right. Aiden's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was the final piece of their lives, falling apart. The room felt frozen in time, the weight of Aiden's lifeless body anchoring the space in unbearable silence. The storm outside continued to rage, as if the heavens themselves were mourning. Naomi was the first to move, her hands trembling as she grabbed Elias by the shoulders. "Listen to me," she said, her voice sharp but shaky. "If anyone finds out about this, we'll lose everything. The church, our reputation, everything we've built. Do you understand?" Elias, still kneeling beside Aiden, shook his head slowly. "He's dead, Naomi. He's dead because of us. How can we live with that?" Naomi straightened, her expression hardening. "We don't have a choice. We can't let this destroy us. Now help me." Her cold pragmatism shocked Elias, but he was too paralyzed by guilt and fear to argue. Together they wrapped Aiden's body in a quilt from the couch, carefully lifting him to avoid leaving any traces of what had happened. Naomi's mind worked quickly, formulating a plan while Elias stumbled through the motions, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "We'll make it look like an accident. Naomi said, her voice tight as they carried Aiden to the car. "No one will question it if we're careful." "What kind of accident?" Elias asked, his voice hollow. Naomi paused, staring out into the stormy night. "We'll leave him near the ravine outside town. It's slippery from the rain. If someone finds him, they'll think he fell." Elias hesitated, his guilt bubbling to the surface. "This isn't right. We should call the police, tell them what happened." "No!" Naomi snapped, her eyes blazing. "If you call the police, you'll lose everything. You'll go to prison. Do you want that? Do you want the entire town to know who you really are?" The words stung, but Elias said nothing. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent his entire life trying to hide his truth, and now it was all unraveling in the worst possible way. The next morning, the town was abuzz with news of Aiden's disappearance. Olivia Harris was frantic, calling everyone she could think of to ask if they had seen her son. Naomi played her part flawlessly, consoling Olivia with words of encouragement while subtly deflecting any suspicion. Elias, on the other hand, could barely meet anyone's gaze. His sermons grew shorter, his voice trembling as he preached about repentance and guilt. But their carefully constructed plan began to fall apart when the police got involved. A search party was organized, and within days, Aiden's body was discovered near the ravine, just as Naomi had planned. At first, the authorities ruled it an accidental fall, but Aiden's mother, Olivia, refused to accept it. "He would never go out there alone," she told the police, her voice cracking with grief. "Something isn't right. Someone knows what happened to my son." Her persistence paid off when investigators found inconsistencies. Aiden's injuries didn't fully align with a simple fall, and traces of fabric matching the quilt Naomi had used to wrap his body were found at the scene. The whispers around town grew louder. Questions about Elias's strange behavior and his sudden closeness to Aiden began circulating. Olivia, suspicious of everyone, pushed harder for answers, determined to uncover the truth. Elias couldn't take the pressure. The guilt consumed him, invading his thoughts and haunting his dreams. Every time he stepped into the pulpit, he felt like a fraud, his words hollow and meaningless. Naomi, meanwhile, urged him to stay strong, to keep up appearances and let the town's gossip fade over time. But Olivia's determination was relentless. She organized a memorial service for Aiden at the church, forcing Elias to stand before the grieving congregation and eulogize the young man whose death he had helped cover up. As he spoke, his voice cracked under the weight of his guilt. His eyes met Olivia's in the crowd, and he saw the raw pain and suspicion in her gaze. It was too much. That evening, Elias broke. Sitting across from Naomi at the kitchen table, he put his head in his hands. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's killing me, Naomi. I have to tell the truth." Naomi's expression hardened. "You'll ruin us. Do you understand that? If you tell the truth, we lose everything." "I've already lost everything," Elias replied, his voice trembling. "I can't live like this anymore." Naomi glared at him, but she could see that his resolve was unshakable, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed her face. Elias knew the time for lies was over, but telling the truth would mean dragging Naomi down with him. The weight of guilt proved too much for Elias to bear. Early the next morning, he walked into the local police station and asked to speak with an officer. Sitting across from the detective, Elias confessed everything: the affair with Aiden, the heated confrontation, the accidental death, and the desperate cover-up that followed. He spared no details, his voice shaking as he recounted the night's events. When the confession ended, the detective regarded him with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You understand the seriousness of what you're admitting to, don't you?" he asked. Elias nodded. "I do, and I'm ready to face the consequences." The fallout was immediate. Police arrived at the couple's home that same day to question Naomi. At first, she denied any involvement, sticking to the story of Aiden's accidental fall, but when confronted with Elias's confession, her composure cracked. "You can't seriously believe him," she snapped, her voice rising. "He's just trying to save himself." But the evidence was damning. The forensic analysis of the fabric found at the scene matched the quilt from their home. GPS data from their car revealed a late-night trip to the ravine on the night of Aiden's death. Confronted with the mounting evidence, Naomi finally broke down and admitted her role in the cover-up. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said quietly. "I was just trying to protect us." The case quickly became the talk of Spring Haven. The shocking revelations about Pastor Elias's affair with Aiden and the subsequent cover-up of his death sent shockwaves through the small conservative town. During the trial, the prosecution painted a damning picture of Elias and Naomi's actions. Elias was charged with involuntary manslaughter for his role in Aiden's death, as well as obstruction of justice for the cover-up. Naomi faced charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice and tampering with evidence. Elias's lawyer argued that his confession was evidence of remorse and a willingness to take responsibility for his actions. Naomi's defense, however, attempted to downplay her involvement, portraying her as a wife who had acted out of panic and fear rather than malice. Aiden's mother, Olivia, sat in the courtroom every day, her face a mask of grief and determination. In a powerful statement, she addressed the court directly, demanding accountability for her son's death. "He trusted both of you," she said, her voice shaking, "and you betrayed him in the worst possible way. I want justice, not just for Aiden, but for everyone who has suffered because of your lies." The verdict came swiftly. Elias was sentenced to 10 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice, with the possibility of parole after 7 years for his cooperation and early confession. Naomi received a 5-year sentence for her role in the cover-up, with parole eligibility after 3 years. The judge acknowledged her lack of involvement in Aiden's death itself, but condemned her actions in trying to conceal the crime. For Olivia, the sentences provided some closure, though no punishment could bring her son back. She vowed to honor Aiden's memory by advocating for LGBTQ+ youth in conservative communities, ensuring no one else would suffer the way her son had. Years later, Elias was released on parole, a quieter, humbler man than the preacher Spring Haven once knew. In a recorded interview with a journalist, he reflected on his actions. "I hurt so many people because I was too afraid to be honest, with myself, with my wife, and with the people who trusted me. I thought hiding would protect everyone, but it only made everything worse. I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life." And that's the story of Pastor Elias, a man whose choices led to heartbreak, betrayal, and justice. What would you have done in Naomi's place? Or Aiden's? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more gripping stories like this.